School of Professional Psychology in 2012. Since then, she's been working in outpatient individual therapy, residential, and inpatient levels of care.
Awesome. And then our next speaker is Dr. Jyoti Shah. Dr. Jyoti Shah specializes in both child and adolescent psychiatry and has more than 9 years of experience. A pediatric/adolescent psychiatrist, is a doctor who specializes in diagnosing and treating mental and emotional conditions in young children and adolescents. She attended medical school at Midwestern University in 2011.
We've prepared a few questions that we'd like to ask Dr. Terada and Dr. Shah. If you also have any additional questions during the session, please type them in the chat or to one of the board members directly, and we'll discuss it at the end of the meeting.
Big thank you to both doctors for being here today. Let's get started with our first question.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want either of us to start, Dr. Terada here, and what does a normal day in the workplace look like for me? Well, that has kind of changed in the last year. As you know, we've had quite a change. But a normal work day in my life actually looks pretty varied. So you see my cat here, and we'll talk about why my cat is here. But a normal work day for me right now looks like taking clients in my office, at least for sessions for an hour. I specialize in eating disorders as well as anxiety and OCD, so I do a lot of exposure therapy. And sometimes those exposures happen virtually, and sometimes people are really scared of cats and furry things and contamination. So this might be something that I do all day, which is kind of weird, having sessions with my cat and having somebody sit there on the screen with them. I talk with individuals that are children, to adolescents, to adults, as well as their families and supports in these sessions, as well as provide assessment and consultation on these issues for other people in the field. I'm also a part of a international board that has a chapter here for eating disorder awareness and mentoring. And do a lot of different things. I've run programs. That is how I know Dr. Shah, who is also still in that program that I ran for 5 years. I've conducted research. I can do a lot of things. But a normal day kind of is flexible in this field if you want it to be for a psychologist. I will hand it over to Dr. Shah and see if she thinks the same.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so my normal work day is a little bit different, mainly because I'm working in the hospital. So, you know, even with all the current COVID stuff going on, I'm still going into the hospital and seeing patients on the inpatient side, sometimes consults on the med floors, taking call for the hospital. And I also see patients in our outpatient program as well. I used to do some outpatient as well, but I've backed off from that a little bit just because I've been more focused on the inpatient and program side of things. So my normal work day basically includes going into the hospital, rounding on the patients. Sometimes because I do some administrative stuff, I will attend some meetings throughout the day as well. And see patients because I work a lot more with adolescents. That'll involve talking to families a lot of times as well after I've met with patients, collaborating with other physicians or providers, especially if I've seen them on the medical floors, and trying to make sure the recommendations are clear and that we've discussed the case, and then, you know, taking the call with the rest of the physicians in the group, kind of generally what my typical work day and week looks like.
Thank you. That was a little bit different for both of you guys. That was really interesting. So what are 2 highlights and 2 downsides of your careers?
I will go first again. I think some of the downsides of my career, I would say, are more of some of the things that you don't really find out until you're in your career, like how to deal with insurance, some of the more business related aspects that A lot of times people go into healthcare fields really wanting to advocate for people and just wanting to do treatment, and there's a lot of other practical stuff that you need to consider. So one of the downsides is I do need to make sure that I'm keeping up with those things, that, you know, I have to work with insurance. And I think Dr. Shaw also has, you know, that probably is another downside. And those administrative things can get in your way. However, I would say there's really not too many downsides that I can think of. That's the one that really comes to mind. I know a lot of clinicians also talk about just the amount of documentation that you have to do. And that is also extremely important in both of our jobs, because if you don't write it down or you don't document, it didn't happen. So that's a part of the advocacy that you have to keep in mind. So there is a lot of behind the scenes sort of stuff that you have to continue doing just to make sure that you're doing proper care. Highlights. Well, right now, getting to work with Elvis, highlight. But I think one of the other highlights that I've always found very interesting about this career is the amount of variety of things that you can do in it. Is that it's so diverse and it's so welcoming to kind of create this vision of what you want to do with your doctorate in psychology, that you can actually take on a wide variety of things at the same time and explore so many different avenues. So I think that that is a highlight of this career too, that a lot of people don't think about.
Great. Yeah, no, I agree with the stuff that Dr. Terada had mentioned. Other things to kind of add, that one of the downsides of our career is, I mean, there is a huge stigma around mental health. And so, you know, you're constantly battling that with patients and families and trying to educate everybody on that, especially, you know, in the adolescent population. A lot of times parents are not as open to or receptive to certain treatment recommendations. I think a lot of that does come from a lot of the stigma associated with mental health. And so just really trying to work with patients and families to try to help them out in the best way that you can. That's another downside that I would kind of think of. Highlights. I think overall, looking at the different kind of career venues of like medicine, I think psychiatry does have a very, very good overall work-life balance, and a lot of that has to do with the flexibility in scheduling. So you can kind of tailor things the way that you want to some degree, and I think that that's nice, and that's helpful to be able to balance out, you know, work and home life. I think is a plus for psychiatry, which is not as common for maybe some of the other specialties in medicine.
Thank you for your input. So our next question is, what are some skills that you think are crucial for success in your profession?
Hands down, the first one I would say is the ability to be open to continuous learning, seeking out consultation, and constantly being a student of yourself. There is a big, vast world of knowledge out there that keeps updating, and we keep finding more and more evidence for different practices, different ways of applying therapy, and also in this world of mental health and sort of how we work is very interdisciplinary. So just like I would need to know sort of some of the things that Dr. Shah does in terms of medications and in neuroscience and all those things, having a good idea of sort of the other pieces of the interdisciplinary team and being aware of that is very crucial. So I think being able to stay open to continuing education, consultation, and interdisciplinary communication are huge. You need to be a communicator in this job, not only for your patients, but to each other, and work as a practitioner that can be on a team advocating for a single patient. So I think that is very, very important to kind of consider. Some other skills that are crucial for success is I think just in any professional field, whether it is, and I don't know if Dr. Shah would agree, is having a sense of patience, because you do have to go through a lot of college and a lot of schooling, and you have to be able to kind of gruel through that. That's going to help you through this. So there's going to be times where there's going to be difficult, challenging patients. There's going to be times where they're successful, like ye hurrahs, and there's ups and downs in all those ways. So having patience and kind of the push forward to go through it and sort of take on those challenges as they come, I think is another crucial skill that you need to have working in these jobs.
Yeah, no, I think that those are really good points. And I think just in addition to kind of the fact that it is very grueling and very time consuming, and you have to really dedicate to your career, is being able to have the ability to do some self-care things as well, to be able to keep yourself, well. I think that's a skill that's important for people as well, to be able to have that ability to do a lot of self-care stuff as well, to balance those things out, and to balance like the intense need for education, and just, meeting with patients and all the aspects of that.
What is some advice I would give to my younger self? Now, this is one, I don't know. I kind of went to where Jyoti kind of, talked about self-care. I kind of went to that one first when I saw this one, is making sure that you do take care of yourself, because you are taking care of others, and that is a huge thing. And making sure that you take time to balance that out. And I think you do have the ability to do that in this career. I would also, kind of say, to myself younger, is, you think it's going to be harder than it is to get through these years, but it goes by quicker than you think. And it's usually not as hard as you think. You're making a mountain out of a molehill when you start. It can be quite daunting going into medical school or to your doctorate, but it actually goes by a lot quicker than you think. So just kind of stay in the lane and do what you have to do. But keeping your friendships alive too is part of your self-care, and keeping connected to people, I think, is a part of the self-care too. So that would be some advice that I would give you if you go into these fields. Keep connected to people. Keep your life going in some form. It's going to save you through this. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. That's a tough question, because I don't know. I mean, yeah, the self-care is the biggest thing. Time management is another thing as well. Kind of making sure that you're able to balance those things out. And, it can get really tough at points, and just kind of keeping your eye on the bigger picture of things. And just making sure that you're balancing those things out so that you don't burn out. Because I think a lot of times, we get so focused on just doing one thing that we burn ourselves out. And I think that's kind of the biggest struggle that we have. So I think being able to balance those things out so that you don't burn yourself out, I think is kind of would be something that I would think about.
I kind of think about this in a way as like, live the feedback that you would give your patients. If you cannot sort of balance that out in your own way and demonstrate that and role model that, that's going to be hard for somebody to take that from you. So if you're saying you need to practice more self-care, and you look like you just woke up and you haven't slept in 48 hours or haven't taken care of yourself, and it kind of looks like you're not doing the things that you need to do, it's really hard to be able to support somebody else in doing that for themselves. So that would be my ultimate advice.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, how do you think psychology and psychiatry are different?
They're way different. I don't know. I mean, I think one, it's interesting because if you look at the history and systems of kind of these two careers, they both came from psychiatry. And psychology was, part of that, assessment and therapy part that psychiatry kind of started to verge into, alongside of, medicine management and the biological kind of treatment of disorders and diseases. And as soon as that kind of broke off to being people who really just focused on the assessment and application and intervention side, it started to seem like these were two very different careers. But in fact, you know, in psychology, we do need to apply a lot of the same things, just in a different way to patients. That's why it's so interdisciplinary. We need to understand and know just as much about the brain, how it works, how it functions, to be able to provide assessment, see what's going on, test and design interventions, but also be able to educate other people on what's going on with certain disorders and diseases. We still have to do the same differential diagnoses, understand medications. We just apply those things in a different way in terms of how we, you know, go about sort of bringing that up in therapy, how we actually practically apply it for the person who's seeking out treatment to enact in their own life. But, you know, I think they are more closely aligned than people actually really think. And I think they complement each other very well, especially if you have a very understanding, you know, team that sort of has the same goals in mind for how to treat a patient.
Yeah, I agree. There is a significant amount of overlap between the two, and they really kind of go hand in hand. I mean, a lot of times we'll get a lot of information from the psychologist and vice versa, and kind of collaborate on the cases together. And so, you know, I think that they both do kind of have very similar kind of backgrounds, and they do provide kind of some insight into these cases. You know, the schooling is a little bit different. I mean, in psychiatry, you have to go through all the medical school piece of things. So there is like that difference with it. But when it comes to like treating the patient, I think like the diagnoses part, you know, like Erin mentioned, you know, the psychologists do have, I mean, they have to have some sort of understanding in terms of medications, and, you know, obviously they get a vast amount of training in diagnoses, and the different types of therapies and all of those things. And so all of those things kind of do generally tend to overlap. So, yeah.
Okay, guys, so before we do the student questions, we have several questions given to us by students on the interest form that you guys did. So our first question that we have is, how do you separate yourself from the trauma that you hear at work?
Okay, well, that's a good one. One, it's not all trauma. There is the possibility, when Dr. Shah actually talked about getting burnt out, and when we talk about self-care, those are the things that I think would be the advice that we would really, really encourage you guys to take, is that there are going to be points or places where, you know, psychologists specialize, and so do psychiatrists. And even though you might not know what walks through your door or might kind of get to you, you do hear a lot of sad stories. You do hear a lot of stressful stories. You do get trauma. However, you do need to be able to have a way of taking care of yourself and separating from somebody else's trauma to be able to help them. If you're just going to join them in it, it's not going to be able to help them. So the more that you can kind of keep that divide, lean on the people who are your friends and colleagues, to kind of support and know your own limits of what you can do. I think those are all really key things to consider.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are all really, really good points. Definitely the self-care piece and being able to disconnect yourself from work when you're at home, so that you have your own time. You're doing things that you enjoy doing, just to kind of be able to detach a little bit from what's going on at work. I think that's healthy to do, so that you have like your own self-care piece of things that I mentioned before. I think is really very, very important. And I really do like the point that Dr. Terada made about colleagues. I think it's really helpful to have others who are in the field who get it and understand, and who you can kind of bounce ideas off of, or even if it's just to vent about things a little bit, just to kind of get things off your chest a little bit. I think those things are really important to have.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, what made you choose psychology or over psychiatry or vice versa?
Oh, Jyoti, do you want to start?
So I had always actually wanted to go the medical route. I initially actually wanted to do pediatrics when I started medical school and went that route. And then I really had a big interest in psychiatry, and realized that there's a thing called child and adolescent psychiatry. And I was like, oh, well, this is great. I can do that because I can get the pediatric side of things and the psychiatry side of things. And so that's what kind of led me into the route that I'm at, and that kind of guided me.
Yeah, I would say for me, I actually started out wanting to do the same thing, wanted to go into psychiatry, wanted to be going the medical route, but specifically in psychiatry. And over time, I kind of learned the things that I really wanted to do more were kind of testing and assessment and spending more time kind of doing the intervention parts of it. That's what I really enjoyed when I started to explore the field more. So that's what kind of led me to psychology. And I saw there was all these different things that you could do that probably weren't in the scope as much as, within, the medical model that I wanted to explore, even though I still really thought that it was an important thing to have. And so I kind of had like a back and forth kind of like, what do I do in this? And ended up in the psychology end. Where now we're seeing kind of there's more of a push to have medical privileged psychologists, which it seems to be kind of coming full circle. So yeah, I ended up there kind of exploring in that area and really started to enjoy just certain things about exploring psychology in particular and all the different things you could do with it that landed me up here.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question is, and you kind of touched on it earlier when we were talking about the differences in your respective careers, but could you maybe talk a little bit about the education process, like college major, grad school, or med school, PhD, etc.?
Okay. Jyoti, do you want to go first? Because it probably is more streamlined for you. Mine's going to be a little bit more complex.
Sure. So, so after high school, I went to college. So I did 4 years of college. I ended up majoring in bioengineering with a pre-med track. And really, to go into medicine, I mean, you could essentially major in whatever you want to, and as long as you have the prerequisites to enter medical school, which is what that pre-med track is listed on there for. And then following college, went to med school, which was 4 years, and then did my residency in adult psychiatry, which was 3 years, and then child psychiatry fellowship, which was an additional 2 years. And then I was finally done with my training. I don't know how many years that adds up to be, but it's a lot.
A lot. So for me, after high school, I went to get my bachelorate, did do a pre-med, but I double majored in the pre-med requisites under biology. I got my BA also in history, doing research and development in that way. So I took that, and then I went to get my PsyD, which is different than a PhD. A PsyD is more of a scholar practitioner model, where a PhD is a more academic scholar model, where you will sit and look and review the research and do the statistics and things like that. In mine, you do all that, but you also sort of engage in the training of the practice at the same time. So while you're going to school, I was going to school full time and accruing clinical hours during that. So it meant by the time I was done with my doctorate, which was 5 years, I had accrued 3,000 hours of practical skill work, as well as completing a full doctorate degree. I then had to do an internship after that, which was a full year, and then a whole nother year of a postdoc fellowship before I could get licensed. So at the end, I did pretty much the equivalent of what Jyoti did, just in a different amount of years of what I had doing.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, how will psychology benefit our everyday lives in other career fields, such as finance or management?
Oh my God, it does so much. There's whole sections of psychology that is dedicated to just those fields. There are things like social psychology. There are things called industrial organizational psychology, where they study, research, and intervene on different levels of how those things work in the business world, how society sort of plays, you know, a role in sort of how we make those economic decisions, but then also in companies, how industry and organizations kind of form, how they are positively affected, negatively affected by the culture around them inside at both a micro and macro level, as well as doing testing and assessment within that company to see sort of how to make it more happy, healthier, and functional. So psychology, I think if we look at it and really sort of take a deep dive, and we could do that for like the next hour and a half, I can talk forever on it, you can find psychology actually applies in a lot of different areas that you may not fully equate it to initially, but there is areas where we're seeing it. We're now seeing a whole nother section of cyber psychology. How does the influence of cyber, you know, sort of interaction, avatars, technology with social media and everything, how is that affecting how we interact? How does, you know, the internet sort of change how we view ourselves, our personalities, you know, everything like that. So there's going to be completely new fields that are burgeoning up as society changes too. So it's not just for what you think it is. There's many different areas where we experiment and look in.
Perfect. Thank you guys. And so now we're going to open the floor to any and all of the students. Feel free to turn on your guys' mics and talk to both of our wonderful doctors here. And if you can, make sure to turn on your camera so we can put some names to faces. So if anyone has anything, feel free to jump in. If you feel more comfortable chatting in the Zoom chat, that is also okay.
This is what we would call a really good exposure. So if you feel uncomfortable, just speak up and see what happens.
What kind of, excuse me, what kind of like math and science like prerequisites should we have in like our undergrad and like just going into high school with like the opportunities that we have at IMSA? Like, what classes do you recommend that we take?
There is a heavy emphasis in my field on statistics, both parametric and non-parametric, and understanding how to do that in research design. So any and everything that goes into that, you're going to have to know it inside and out. Even if you don't do a research study, you're going to have to be able to understand the application of that and understand what is good research versus not when you start looking at articles and evidence-based practice to further your understanding in this field.
Yeah, I don't think my track was as heavy on statistics, thankfully. Thankfully.
I love statistics.
I think I took one statistics class in college, and that was it.
I
it was
had
not
like
good.
5, so there.
But the science classes, definitely a lot in terms of chemistry, physics, biochemistry, all of those, like, I mean, this definitely very science heavy. Biology classes,
anatomy.
The math, I mean, I don't think there's as much for prerequisites for medicine specifically. I mean, I took a lot of math classes, mainly I think it was more because of the engineering background. But I think the prerequisites for like med school, I think, is very science focused. So
probably definitely more chemistry, biology, physical sciences, as well as the physics, as well as some other sciences, just to make sure that you had all the prerequisites to go in. So yeah.
And so so it was definitely very focused on that, I think, as some of the prerequisites, and I think English a little bit in there too, if I remember correctly.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
And I know everyone is talking a lot about psychology and psychiatry, but I can throw in the counselor game for a second or two, because the counselor lens tends to come from more theory based, so working from a theory and that scope of humanism. So it takes a little bit from psychology, but it's not based in as much diagnostics. And as someone who is working in a program right now, or working through a program that is a PhD-based program for education, counselor education, it is heavy research. So they require you to take 3 or 4 statistics-based courses. They require you to take about 3 or 4 research-based courses. So you're talking about 6, 7, maybe even 8. And
Yeah.
it's encouraged to even go for a supplemental, so you can because you want to be able to do qualitative research and quantitative research and then mixed methods research. So they want you to understand at that level how to do all of that type of research.
So I watched a TED Talk at one point about Martin Seligman and positive psychology. So I was just wondering if you guys felt that that was like a large turning point, or something that you thought was kind of already there, or just your ideas on that.
I think with, Martin Seligman and making that move to more positive psychology, I think that really made an impact in a lot of different ways. But the field of psychology started to go that way anyways. He brought to light actually a more understanding of kind of looking at strength-based. But there were other people who kind of got on that bandwagon along the same time, such as the people who started acceptance and commitment therapy, the people who started with DBT, all the cognitive behavioral therapies kind of merged along that same sort of lens. So Seligman brought up that idea of kind of looking to people's strengths and using sort of more of these, kind of positive attributes than just sort of this, stigmatizing, downward looking like you're in a disorder and this is how we have to treat you in a disease model. Which is still highly used today. I think more appreciated today than when it first came out when he introduced it. However, there's more of a wave, I think now, even in our culture, to be more open to wellness practices. And I think that that is what made more of what Seligman first put out more acceptable now, because at the time it was still in that stigma, and there is ways that we still are fighting a lot of the mental health stigma in the whole culture, what Jyoti talked about earlier. But in terms of what he did, he actually kind of flipped the whole model or theory on its head and said, hey, if you look at it from this instead of from the bottom up, let's look at the top down. Everything that's good about this person, we need to sort of fuel them to move forward. And some of the more turns in the third wave of therapy that is going on now really do take that into high consideration when we look at how we sort of approach a case. So I do think I think it took a lot of time for people to like really sort of absorb it and take it in. But it did do some shifts. There were other people started trying to make those shifts too at the same time, and it just took a while. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
We have about 5 more minutes with our wonderful doctors. So if anyone has additional questions, now is a good time to pick their brains.
What really inspired you to go into psychology or psychiatry, considering all of the difficulties or just the long amount of schooling?
I would say when I, at the beginning of this, talked about patient advocacy and being somebody who could support and help other people through things, I think I kind of found I had a natural sort of desire or curiosity about people and human nature, but that kind of grew into wanting to support them through those things that were not so great things. So I think that kind of grew into wanting to go into the helping field and be in service to other people and try to help as much as I can. That's sort of what drew me to it. I don't know about you, Jyoti.
Yeah, I think just being able to provide that education to people and really advocating for patients and families, I think was kind of a big draw for me, because I think that there, like I mentioned before, there is so much stigma, and even just amongst other physicians or providers, just not quite understanding sometimes psychiatry. So just being able to kind of advocate, I think is kind of the biggest thing that kind of pulled me in this direction.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like we have a question in the chat. What were the differences from working at a smaller private practice versus in a hospital?
Oh, there's a lot. Jody's laughing. Jyoti and I worked actually for a good 5 years. And a little history, 7 years ago, I worked with Kevin for a very long time. We're both very old and have known each other forever. I think it was like how long ago, Kevin?
2006, 2007.
So old. So I worked in a hospital with Kevin, and then I also worked in a hospital with Jyoti. And there is a big difference between hospital work and outpatient work. I think, Kevin, you can also speak to this as well as Jyoti. I think it's the severity, the pace of work, as well as how you might have to balance your time. The pace is a really, really big thing that stands out. In inpatient, it is very acute. People are usually at the worst point of their lives and very severe at those points. And it's going to be very, very short, but crisis management at those points. Outpatient, you can spend a lot more time getting to know somebody and actually treat somebody for an extended period of time, 6 months, year, a couple of years, and really grow in that relationship with them and supporting them through their troubles. And then there's different levels of care in between there, from partial hospitalization to intensive outpatient to residential. And each of those have a different pace because people are at a different level of need.
Yeah, I agree that the pace is kind of the biggest difference, I would say, between outpatient and inpatient. So yeah, and usually in outpatient, the call might be different because just from a physician standpoint, when you're working inpatient, your call is a little bit on the heavier side compared to outpatient. I know some outpatient providers don't do call. It just depends on where your job is at and what the requirements are. But so that's a little bit different as well.
And I guess I can chime in on the educational side of things because you can work in an area that's very rural, an area that's very diverse, lots of things happening throughout the day. You never really know what is going to happen on campus, if there's going to be some type of crisis, some type of suicidality, some type of issue on the campus around safety. There's a lot of different things that happen in education that almost mimic working inpatient because you just never know and you have to be ready and prepared for whatever happens. But then it does have lulls. So there are times where it is like an outpatient where you're getting to know students and you're able to do some type of programming and really getting into the community and building those bonds. So, education kind of throws a little bit of those two pieces together. But there is a fair amount of intensity that can happen working within a school system.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. So we are out of time. I'd like to thank Dr. Terada and Dr. Shah and Kevin for facilitating this wonderful event. Before everyone heads out, I do have a feedback form. Depending on how you guys like this event, or if you guys didn't like it, you guys can please fill out this form so we can better arrange our next event. But yeah, thank you guys for showing up. Thank you, Dr. Shah. Thank you, Dr. Terada, once again, and thank you, Kevin. Awesome.
Great,
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.